Hello and welcome everyone to History Fox. Today we are honored to host a very distinguished guest whose work illuminated the more neglected parts of history. So join me in welcoming Adam Hochschild, who is a best-selling author, journalist and historian. You probably know his work. It is about the lesser known parts of history, and his career spans over several decades, and it's also a variety of topics. So, for example, the most popular work of yours is the best-selling book King Leopold's Ghost, which sheds a light on the atrocious colonial regime of the Belgian King Leopold II over the Congo, which is today the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is also crazy because I read that 9 out of 10 publishing houses refused to publish the book and it still became a bestseller. And by doing so, it tremendously increased the public awareness of this topic. So I think that that's amazing. And your other works also follow onto this tradition in uncovering or narrating stories of resistance and the human spirit and injustices. For example, your works To End All Wars or Bury the Chains, which delves into the heart of the social justice movement. The same is with your most recent book, which was published last year in 2022, which is American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace, and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis, which also has the topic of a lesser known period of history, or which is not taught in US history so much in the school books. It's around the time around the First World War, especially from 1970 to 1921, but which is crucial because in this time, the societal and political landscape, as still echoing today, was shaped. So, as you can see, Adam's writing is not just about history, it is about the people. It is about the people's struggle and human rights and shedding the lights on periods that are lesser known. So, today we want to dive into your inspirations, into your challenges in capturing these complex narratives and your perspective on how the past informs the present and the future. So, Adam, thank you so much for joining us here today. It is an absolute privilege to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Tan. And it's good to be with you and with your audience, which I believe you said is spread over many countries.
Exactly. Thank you so much. So I start right away. When I was reading your books or doing a little bit research about you, it becomes very clear that you focus, as I already said, on this more neglected or ignored periods or events in history. So I was wondering why you especially choose these parts and not, for example, I don't know, the American Civil War or Churchill or Napoleon, those very popular events.
Yeah.
Like, is it some kind of moral responsibility? Is it to pay tribute or justice? Is it to maybe challenge the historical narrative? Maybe we remember things in the wrong way. Is it to do something wrong right?
I think it's all of those things. I don't think the world needs another biography of Churchill or Napoleon. I think that all countries tend to celebrate their history and to focus on particular parts of it, which in their eyes make them look glorious and that they can feel proud of it. And they tend to ignore the other parts of history. And to me, those are the parts that are more interesting because the world that we live in is a world built on colonialism, slavery, exploitation of labor, many other things. It's built on those as well as heroic deeds and wars won and great statesmen and so forth. And I just don't like to go where other writers have already gone. For every country, it's different, but in the United States, sort of the 3 most popular subjects for history writers are the American Civil War, which terrible conflict was resolved and the country stayed together. The Second World War, where we are always portrayed as the unalloyed heroes, although I think the story is actually much more complicated than that, and the founding of this country, the people we call the Founding Fathers. We don't need another book about the Founding Fathers, and it's very difficult to find something new to say about World War II. So for me, it's much more fun, more interesting to find subjects and readers don't know much about. And that's what I enjoy doing. And also those subjects tend to be things that got swept under the rug, so to speak, because they reflected shame on a country rather than pride.
Yeah, I understand. It's like the people who are glorified or the people who are demonized are maybe the wrong people. So I appreciate that approach. When I read your books in business terms, we always say thinking out of the box. So I think it's like thinking out of the box, but not by like jumping into the next box, but by, look outside on this box.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that approach. Also, your storytelling, people approach that they are always those heroes, but also those villains, that we can empathize and get inspired. For example, in King Leopold's Ghost, You have Mr. Morale or Washington Williams, who are our heroes. And we have clear villains, of course, King Leopold and Leon Rom, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think it's not pure heroes and villains, because most of us have some of both in us. But yes, there certainly are heroic figures who've gotten forgotten, although they're often flawed heroes, which makes it more interesting in a way. But, it's these people who are forgotten who struggled against great injustice, even if they were not perfect people themselves, that I do love to bring to the attention of readers. Yeah.
Yeah, so that makes really fun reading about it. I also read that you were in Africa, in the Congo region itself. You saw this kind of plundering. Was it before your book was written or was it after that?
Well, in a way, I am a direct beneficiary of imperialism because I grew up in a family where my father was an executive of an American-based international mining company. And during the time I was growing up, it owned shares of mines in what is now Zambia, what was then northern Rhodesia. And my father made what may have been the mistake of, when I was a teenager, bringing me with him on a business trip to Africa. And I suddenly realized that my university education and a comfortable life was being paid for by the labor of African miners working far under the earth for not very much money. And that was kind of my first introduction to how imperialism worked in a way. And I wrote about that in my first book, Half the Way Home, a memoir of father and son, which is a story of my trying to come to terms with all that. A complicated story because my father in many ways was an extremely progressive man who was an ardent opponent of the Vietnam War and got into trouble with the US government as a result of it. Anyway, that was my first book, but that sort of opened my eyes to imperialism generally. And then when I stumbled upon this subject of King Leopold in the Congo, I realized that was another pathway into that story.
Okay, so you've already been there and you met this kind of resource curse.
The resource curse, where a country that is incredibly rich in natural resources, often I use the analogy, it's like a young heiress who is heiress to a large fortune. Everybody wants to marry her, and she has to protect herself. And often the countries that have those resources don't protect themselves very well. I think the Congo, today the Democratic Republic of Congo, is a prime example of this because per square kilometer, there's probably more mineral wealth in the ground there than almost anywhere else on Earth. They've got cobalt, coltan, gold, diamonds, uranium, not to mention timber growing above ground and all kinds of other resources as well. But this vast territory, over much of it, there's not really a functioning national government. And so the people who are making profits off all of this are local warlords, some corrupt government officials, multinational corporations. Now China is in the act as well as Western corporations. And the average person in the Congo lives in extreme poverty on the equivalent of no more than $2 or $3 American per day. I've been there in recent years a couple of times and seen it. If you stand near the border in Eastern Congo, you can see all that wealth leaving the country. You can see trucks driving across loaded with timber. You can see planes overhead flying tin ore out of the country. You can see men on motorcycles crossing the border will probably have gold dust hidden in their shoes or sewn into their clothes so it can't be seen by customs officials. And the people who are getting rich from all this are not the Congolese themselves. So this is an example of what we see in many parts of the world, but it's one of the most extreme example there.
So many parts of Africa, there were also before, like end of the 19th century, when they divided how King Leopold said this delicious cake of Africa among the Europeans. It was more controlled by the Arab countries or Arab salespeople, but it kind of got then more industrialized, I guess, when the white men came. And then the scapegoat was then the Arabs, right? And the white people, they came to, or that's at least what they said, to bring civilization, bring the salvation from the European continent to Africa, doing something good, being the white savior.
Well, the rest of the world has always been very skilled at extracting wealth from Africa for hundreds of years, because really starting hundreds of years ago, African slaves were transported from the west coast of Africa to the Americas, to the principal slave-only parts of the Americas, which were Brazil, the Caribbean, and what's now the United States. Similarly, Arab slave traders were transporting slaves from the east coast of Africa to the Arab and Islamic world. And they were cooperating with local slave traders who were capturing people deep in the middle of the continent and marching them to the coast in very arduous, painful, deadly forced marches of hundreds and hundreds of kilometers so that they could be loaded on ships at the two coasts. I mean, this started many centuries ago, before the big European land grab, what's usually called the scramble for Africa, which started around 1870. And that progressed with tremendous speed. In 1870, for example, roughly 80% of Africa south of the Sahara Desert was under the rule of Africans in one way or another. Kings, tribal chiefs, other forms of local governments. It wasn't all enlightened territory. Some of these societies were slaveholding societies, which was why ship captains on each coast could so easily find slaves to buy. But it was under African rule. In 1870, as I say, 80% of the continent. By 1910, 40 years later, virtually the entire continent, with only a few exceptions, was under colonial rule by European countries or by white settler regimes like that in South Africa. So this was the biggest and swiftest land grab in history, basically. It happened very swiftly because the Europeans had tools that the Africans didn't have. They had fast ships that could go up and down the coasts, carrying their military forces. They had steamboats, which would go up the great African rivers, like the Congo River, transporting their soldiers and colonial officials there. They had machine gun, they had small cannon, they had the telegraph to communicate. So these were the tools that allowed imperialism to take over the continent so swiftly.
Before this imperial era started at the end of the 19th century, there was already, as you said, a transatlantic slave trade and exploitation happening in Africa, like on a different scale. And there were already anti-slavery movements, right? As you write about in Bury the Chains, for example. It's kind of not so popular neither, right? To know about that there were hundreds of thousands of people who signed for these petitions, right?
That's right. The story I told in Bury the Chains was of one nation and its empire, Great Britain, because I focused on them for a couple of reasons. First, they were a major colonial power with colonies throughout the West Indies, the Caribbean, which were slave colonies, where slaves were imported in huge numbers from Africa to work the plantations there, growing coffee, indigo, and mainly sugar. And two things happened. First, there were a series of slave revolts in the Caribbean, not just in British colonies, but in other colonies as well, because on each of those Caribbean islands, there were many more slaves than Europeans. The ratio was anywhere from 5 to 1 to 20 to 1 on some of the smaller islands. And the slaves thought, quite logically, there's so many of us, there's so few of them. If we could just rise up and seize the weapons, we could take over. So there were a succession of slave revolts. Also, in Britain itself, and it was different from the other European countries in this way, there was a quite large, popular, widespread anti-slavery movement. And when news of that reached the islands in the Caribbean, it tended to stimulate slave revolts there. And when news of those revolts reached Britain, it tended to stimulate the movement there. And the combination of the two things finally led the British Empire to free its slaves in the 1830s, which was before almost all the other European countries did so, and certainly before slavery ended in the United States.
So you focus on, in your book, of course, it's called King Leopold's Ghost, on the Belgian colony, the former Congo Free State. The other European powers, they also had colonies and they also committed atrocities. But you decided to write this book about King Leopold and these crimes there. Was it because there was like a gap in knowledge, or is it because it was exceptionally cruel?
There were a couple of reasons that made the Congo a particularly interesting thing to focus on. In the first place, it was the only colony in Africa that was owned for quite a long period of time, 23 years, not by a country, but by one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. King Leopold took the throne of Belgium in 1865 when he was 30 years old. And he was very frustrated at being king of such a small country. And he made no secret of that. He said, petit pays, petit gens, small countries, small-minded people. He was also frustrated at being a king when it wasn't so much fun to be a king anymore because you had to share power with elected parliaments increasingly as the 19th century went on. So he wanted a place where he could reign supreme. And just at that time, the scramble for Africa was starting. So he hired the British explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, to go to the center of the continent and basically stake out this huge territory for him, to map it, find out just where the Congo River and its tributaries went, and stake a claim there for the king. And then, starting in 1884, he persuaded first the United States and then all the major nations of Europe to recognize this territory as belonging to him personally. And for 23 years, he ruled it, the Congo Free State, as it was called in English, or État indépendant du Congo in French. That made him the target of a lot of anger in Europe by people who felt, well, colonialism is, understandable and part of the normal order of things, but one man owning a whole country, there's something fishy about that. Also, King Leopold pioneered a particularly terrible form of slavery, forced labor, to exploit this territory. The Congo, his Congo, was very rich in wild rubber, which grew on vines that twined around palm trees and other trees up to where they could get some sunlight. And starting in the early 1890s, there was a worldwide rubber boom because they had invented the inflatable tire. There was a huge demand for rubber in industry, coke, telephone, and telegraph wires. And of course, the automobile came along. People needed tires for automobiles. So there was a big demand for rubber all over the world. But to start a plantation of rubber trees, you have to wait about 15 years before they can grow to maturity and you can begin extracting rubber from them. However, in an area like the equatorial rainforest in Africa, where rubber grew wild, you didn't have to wait. Leopold had more of that equatorial rainforest than anybody else. So how did he exploit it? Basically, he sent his private army. This was 19,000 officers and men, black conscript soldiers under white officers, into village after village. They would take the women hostage in order to force the men to go into the rainforest for days and sometimes weeks each month to gather a quota of wild rubber. And you can actually see photographs of these women hostages chained up. The men are sometimes in chains as well. So news of this reached Europe, and it provoked great outrage. There was a very spirited, energetic British journalist, Edmund Dean Morrell, who made this his cause and sort of put it on the world's front pages. And people got outrageously outraged about this, particularly in the English-speaking countries, Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also in other countries as well. There were protest marches and demonstrations and meetings and so forth. What people paid much less attention to was that the other European countries that had rubber-producing areas in Africa, principally France, Germany, and Portugal, looked at how much money Leopold was making from this forced labor system, and they mimicked it and did the same thing, starting a few years later. But their atrocities got far less attention because the movement was focused on King Leopold's Congo, and there was sort of the additional outrage that all this territory was owned by one man.
I was also reading in your book about Joseph Conrad, who was one of the few of the writers, the authors of that time, who decided to actually write about these atrocities, or maybe also saw them with his own eyes. So we are grateful for him to write that down, because, if not, maybe there might have not so many witnesses, right?
That's right. Conrad went to the Congo as a steamboat officer in training for 6 months in 1890. And he was expecting this sort of romantic, exploring unknown territories and so forth, the romantic dream that people have of being explorers and pioneers. And he found himself in the middle of this horror show. It was, as he declared, the greatest scramble for loot ever seen. At that time, it was just before the rubber boom had started, and the loot that people were scrambling for was ivory. And the Europeans who were there were eager to get rich by grabbing all the ivory they could and exporting it back to Europe. It was 10 years before Conrad got this onto paper in his great novel, Heart of Darkness, where he certainly does give a picture of the immense European hunger for wealth in Africa. Ironically, Conrad himself was not particularly opposed to colonialism if it was British colonialism, because he had become a British citizen by that point and was quite patriotic about England and felt that in Britain's colonies, certainly nothing like this ever went on. That was respectable colonialism. Which is curious, because almost all of these people who were involved in the protest movement against King Leopold's Congo, and Conrad wasn't directly involved, but he had friends who were, they weren't opposed to colonialism in general, but they just felt, this particular colonialism was brutal and outrageous because it was all enriching one man.
And it's kind of a tragedy to think about that the Congo, or Democratic Republic of Congo, as it is called today, is still over 100 years after this happened, not a stable country and can't really flourish, even though it has so many riches, so many resources. So would you say that it is still kind of held as it was back then hostage? It's held hostage by the white men.
Yes, in a way. I think we can see the after effects of colonialism all over Africa, where the riches of the country still tend to flow outside the country. A rare exception to this, interestingly, is a country not too far from the Congo, Botswana, which has done a far better job. And first of all, ever since its independence, it's enjoyed a pretty honest government. And also the great riches Botswana has, diamonds, weren't discovered until after the British had left. I sometimes wonder if its history would have been different if they had been discovered while the British were still there. And then Botswana has basically kept the wealth from its diamonds and said to foreign mining companies, yes, you can come and invest and build diamond mines here, but you have to give us, the government, at least 50% control of these mines. And they've also forced the mining companies to bring the processing of the diamonds, what economists call value added, to Botswana itself, instead of sending the diamonds to be cut, polished, and so forth in Europe. So that creates jobs there. And as a result, Botswana scores way ahead of most of the rest of the continent on per capita income and other social welfare measures.
Yeah, that's what's said, right? That's also part of why a lot of African countries are still today so poor, because they have the resources. So they are actually rich, but they don't have the industry, or it was never built up, or it's just exploited, shipped to Europe or to America, and then, produced into something valuable and then sold.
That's right. That's right.
So, which is kind of ironically, I read that your book, King Leopold's Goals, got praised by the American Historical Association and gave the title of the Theodore Roosevelt Woodrow Wilson Award in 2008. And I think that's kind of ironic, because with your new book, Woodrow Wilson is like shown in such a bright light, right?
That's right. That award is named after two American presidents who were also writers of history, and both were also presidents of the American Historical Association. Theodore Roosevelt especially, was an ardent believer in colonialism, and Woodrow Wilson, not so much so, but he presided over a fairly repressive regime in his second term, which was what I described in my most recent book, American Midnight, of the extreme repression that the United States underwent in the years 1917 to 21. Two things happened then. And this, like most of the other things I've written about, this tends to be something skipped over in the classrooms of our high schools and so on, as all countries tend to skip over embarrassing periods in their own history. It's certainly history that specialists know about, and I learned a great deal from other specialist historians, but notably in an average American high school history textbook, there's one chapter on the First World War, where we hear about the heroic American soldiers who went off to Europe, helped win the war, came home, were welcomed by parades, and then you turn the page and the next chapter is the 1920s, when all sorts of things were invented, the phonograph, the talking movies, Major League Baseball became an enormous thing, and so forth. And we skip over this period in between. Basically, two things happened. In 1917, the U.S. finally joined the First World War. And joining a major war does strange things to a country. It provides an excuse for hysteria, an excuse for repression. And this it did in a huge way. And then this was followed 6 months later by the Russian Revolution in November 1917. And many people in positions of power in the United States were greatly afraid, not realistically so, I don't think, but they were afraid that the example of the Russian Revolution would spread to the United States. Those two things provided the basis for a kind of political repression, which I think is the most severe we've seen in this country since the immediate aftermath of American slavery. The government operated press censorship on a huge scale, shut down some 75 newspapers and magazines. There was a government-sponsored vigilante group which went around arresting people and roughing them up if they didn't have the right papers to show that they were registered for military conscription. And there were a sizable number of American political prisoners, that is, people who were sent to jail solely for things that they wrote or said. Roughly 1,000 Americans served a year or more in prison during this time period solely for things that they wrote or said, and a much larger number shorter periods of time. All this tends not to get mentioned in the high school history textbook, and that's the kind of material that attracts me to write about.
That's fascinating. I also need to say, when I had my history courses in school, high school, when I was like teenage, we also learned, of course, about the aftermath of the First World War. And we also got introduced to this name, Woodro Wilson. He was always kind of mentioned in association with the League of Nations and with the 14 points program. So he was always, at least in our textbooks, kind of colored as this very progressive president who wanted to build up the relationships, like a diplomatic relationships between the countries, so they don't have to go into war. But now reading that at the same time, he kind of went into war against his own citizens. As a bitter taste, you know what I mean?
Yes. I mean, he was a complicated person, and he's not somebody whom I can loathe or hate unconditionally, which is what I would say of a couple of more recent American presidents. There was a side of him that was very idealistic. He believed passionately in the League of Nations, and no one can deny that it's better for countries to sit down around a table and talk out their differences than to go to war. And he had this great dream that the League would come into existence and the United States would be its most influential member, and there would never be wars anymore. And he was so devoted to this dream that it really shortened his life, because when he was in very bad health, he embarked on a strenuous months-long speaking tour of the United States. And in those days, there were no public address systems, no amplification system. And you wanted to talk to 10,000 people in a stadium, you had to show. He was doing this day after day. And it was on that trip that he suffered the first of several severe strokes, which really shortened his life. At the same time, he virtually ignored the extreme degree of repression, political repression that was going on, carried out by other people in his administration. It wasn't that he was cheering it on. Yes, lock them up, lock them up. He just ignored it. He paid very little attention to it.
Also, I wasn't that aware of Woodrow Wilson, that he was actually so much anti-war first, that he did not wanted to get America involved into the Great War. But then at a certain point, he changed his mind. And you're right that it was because of the debts, right? The Britons and France had.
The way the story is usually told to us, Americans, is that in August 1914, the First World War broke out in Europe, and these European countries for several years at each other's throats and slaughtering each other in large numbers, and the United States stood aside. We were neutral. And then those nasty Germans started sinking American ships, and so we had to join the war. But it didn't really happen that way, because from the beginning, even though the United States was officially neutral, American business was free to do business with both sides. But they couldn't do business with Germany and Austria-Hungary because they were surrounded by a very, very tight British naval blockade, and other ships could not get through to their ports. But American business did an enormous amount of trade with Britain, France, Italy, Russia, the Allied countries, selling them large quantities of arms, of steel to make more weapons, of rubber, of other supplies of all kinds. So we were, in effect, sending military supplies to one side in this war. And finally, Germany said, which had been not sinking the supplies if they traveled in American ships, but only if they were in British or French ships. Germany said, well, we're going to mark off certain areas of the ocean in which no ships of any country are allowed to travel because they're carrying war supplies. Quietly, they offered to negotiate behind the scenes with Wilson to make some exceptions to this, but Wilson didn't take up that offer at all. And he was worried, and I think the whole American business establishment was worried, that the war was a stalemate. And unless the United States joined, there was no chance that Americans would be repaid all the money that they were owed for these supplies, and that they would be able to redeem the British and French and Russian war bonds that they had purchased. And of course, they were never able to redeem the war bonds from Tsarist Russia. So I think this was one thing that helped push Wilson to ask Congress to declare war.
Yeah, and I also found out that there was this kind of two sides opposing each other. There was the anti-war fraction, and there is the other side, the more conservatives or like right-wingers who are more enthusiastic about waging themselves into the war. And I read in one of your articles about this poor soldier who went to Europe on the front in France, and right before the armistice, he wanted to run to the German line, and they tried to stop him, but they were so enthusiastic that he got killed, right?
That's right. War brings a certain madness to any country that takes part in it. And the First World War ended in a particularly insane way, where, as is well known, there was a meeting between the two sides, and they agreed that the war would end at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of that month at 11 o'clock in the morning. And the armies on both sides received that information by radio and telegraph and telephone 5 or 6 hours before that. But most of the Allied armies kept on attacking during those 5 or 6 hours, and thousands of soldiers were killed and wounded, even though their commanders knew the war was going to end in a matter of hours. Total insanity. And some of the soldiers themselves got caught up in that insanity.
And when they came back, the soldiers to America, the war economy was not available anymore. So a lot of them lost their jobs, so they couldn't get into employment anymore. And then there were additionally these racial tensions that then the white people thought, okay, the black people, they will take away our jobs. And then it heated up, right? You talking about this
That's right.
three conflict parties, capital labor and racial conflicts, right?
Yeah. The year 1919, right after the war ended, was a very bloody one in the United States because we had some 4 million troops in the U.S. Army. About half of whom made it to Europe, half of them were still in training camps in the U.S., and they were all demobilized and released into the economy during 1919. But the jobs weren't there for them because the war industries that had been making airplanes and tanks and guns and rifles and bullets and so on had shut down. There was tremendous competition for jobs, and as often happens in the United States, that was expressed in racial competition, where 400,000 black ex-soldiers were competing for jobs with nearly 4 million white ex-soldiers. And that year saw really the worst racial violence in American history since the aftermath of slavery. Hundreds and hundreds of people killed, almost all of them black, almost always in instances where white mobs had started the violence. And Wilson said almost nothing about any of this.
So you said Wilson was personally not cheering up for these kind of tensions, but he also didn't stop it. Also the tensions against workers' alliances, you call them the Wobblies, right?
Yes, this was also a very repressive time against labor in the United States. People wanting to organize labor unions had none of the protections for doing so that they acquired later on. And labor organizing had long been a very violent thing in the United States, much more so than in most of Europe. Just in 1913, 14, before the war, for example, alone, more than 70 people, some of them women and children, had been killed in a miners' strike in Colorado that was put down by both company police and government militia. And this kind of action continued. Attempts by workers to organize unions, to strike, were put down again by private police forces and by the government. It remained a very, very violent business. Anybody trying to organize a labor union in a major American industry faced huge violent opposition. And this added to the violence during these years.
Yeah, you also write that, for example, Eugene Debs, he was like the socialist leader of the Socialist Party, and Emma Goldman, who was feminist anarchist. And she, for example, she was deported even from the US. And some people who were suspicious to be involved in the labor movement, they were tarred and feathered.
That's right. A traditional American punishment. And Eugene Debs, whom we mentioned, was somebody who ran a number of times as the socialist candidate for president. In 1912, he received 6% of the popular vote for president, the highest that a socialist has received in a national election. He did not run in 1916 because he believed Wilson's promises or implicit promises that he would keep the United States out of the war. So Debs didn't want to compete with him. And that he spoke out against him. In 1918, and for one anti-war speech in a park in Ohio, he was sentenced to prison for 10 years, and he was still in prison in 1920. In the presidential election that year, when he was again the socialist candidate and received nearly 1 million votes. It was the first time that somebody had run for president in the United States from inside a jail cell. Possibly not the last time. We'll see what happens to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I really hope this will turn out well for you guys, because this is exactly where I want to go now. I think it was you who said that History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I guess there are some similarities, right, from what happened 100 years ago and what is happening now. I mean, the times back then, they were also full of demagogues and populists. And maybe today they have other means, right? They have social media. Back then, propaganda worked differently, but it's still here, right?
Some of the same forces are there. I think of this 1917 to 21 period as the most Trump-like period of American history before Trump. And that's one thing that attracted me to it. And you see a lot of the same themes in what Trump is saying today and has been throughout his presidency. First, the problem is foreigners, and we have to keep these foreigners from coming into the United States and build a wall at the border and deport people who are already here. Well, there were lots of people saying that 100 years ago. It's a sort of constant theme in American politics. Keep the immigrants out and deport those who are already here. And of course, it's the people whose ancestors came a generation or two earlier who are always talking about keeping out the newcomers. So that theme is still there. Trump is still somebody who believes in closing the media to his opponents. You know, he described the news media as the enemy of the American people. Why? Because, they were airing the views of people who didn't agree with him. So, he represents a number of themes which we have seen before in this country's life and which I hope will get defeated in next year's presidential election. We need people like you from the rest of the world to come to this country and vote so as to help us keep him out of office again.
I really wish you luck with this. I think for a lot of countries, it's a hard time for the populists and demagogues. They kind of got really loud in the last years, unfortunately. And also, what is, I think, something that rhymes, I'm not sure if you agree, it's this hunt for scapegoats, as you said. For example, now
Absolutely.
deportation of immigrants. But back then, it were also the Germans, right? In your book, you even said your grandfather was like German speaking. At a certain point, he didn't want to speak it in public anymore.
Yes. For the period that the United States was in the war, from April 1917 until the war ended November 1918, there was tremendous anti-German hysteria in the United States. And my grandfather was a German-speaking Jew who had immigrated from Germany and spoke German with my father and his brother and sister at home, but they were terrified of doing so on the street because you could get beaten up for speaking German in public. And states passed laws against speaking German in public or speaking German on the telephone. There were bonfires of German language books outside libraries and schools around the country. Incredible stuff. And this lasted until the war ended. And then the target of the hysteria quickly became Russians because of the Russian Revolution. And the anti-German hysteria faded quite rapidly because, after all, at that time, something like 8 or 10 million Americans had German ancestry of some sort, and most of them were just as crazily patriotic as everybody else. So the anti-German hysteria came to an end pretty quickly with the end of the war, but anti-red, anti-Russian hysteria continued for decades after that.
Yeah, so they're kind of always scapegoats. As you said, it shifted from the Germans to the Russians, the Bolsheviks, but there was always this anti-Semitism. There was kind of always hate for Jews, unfortunately. And additionally, these days, I think there are also like people from Arabic countries or who have like heritage, who speak an Arab language in public, especially I think after 9/11, it was a no-go. If you spoke that in public, you were like immediately a terrorist. So there's like always hunt for a scapegoat.
Absolutely. This is a constant theme in American history and, in the history of other countries as well. And I think you're right that right now it's Muslims who are bearing the brunt of the hostility.
I think also you guys in the US, at least what I see in the media, it's also like people from the LGBTQ, feminists, and Mexicans, right?
I mean, the hysteria against LGBTQ people had sort of died down after a while with, Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage and so on. But now it's heated up again over trans issues. And this is a big theme on the right, that the Democrats are trying to get all our children to change their gender, and being trans is seen as hugely threatening.
As you said, this kind of xenophobia, hunt for scapegoats. And what I think it's from a non-American point of view, very American, is this hyper-patriotism or this kind of toxic patriotism. So it's not like an honest patriotism, that you're really like proud of your language, of your culture, of your heritage, but it's more about building a blockage to all the others.
Yes, I think there's a kind of healthy patriotism where it is possible to be proud of your language and culture and some things about your country without denigrating and looking down on the languages and cultures of other people. I mean, there are many things about American society that I like a great deal. Our informality, our openness, our, traditions of free speech. There are many things to love in this country, but that doesn't mean that we have to celebrate everything America does on the world stage. And it doesn't mean we have to look down our noses at other countries.
Maybe you can also give us a title for this decade. The 1970, 1971 is American Midnight. So pretty much the darkest hour maybe of the day. And what would you call it? What is happening now? Is it midnight or do we still have a little bit of brightness?
I think it's a competition between midnight and dawn. I actually think, even though I'm very worried about the upcoming presidential election, I do think that the conditions of dissent and free speech are better established in this country right now than they were 100 years ago. It would not be as easy for a repressive government under Trump to shut down opposition, to close down critical media, and so forth. I think we do have a court system that is more independent of the other branches of government than exists in many countries. And I think people, for all our faults, and there are many, I think people have a greater appreciation of the importance of free speech in this country today than they did 100 years ago. But we'll still be in huge trouble if Trump wins the presidential election.
Looking at the heroes you find in your books, like for example, this bureaucratic warrior, right? This Mr. Post, Louis Post. We also have these people today. So in 100 years, people will look back and they will find these small heroes.
I hope they will. Louis Post, whom you mentioned, was an interesting example when I talk about an American Midnight, where key people at that time wanted to do massive deportations. A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General under Woodro Wilson, was hoping to be the Democratic nominee for president in 1920, wanted to be the law and order candidate and to campaign on track record of having deported huge numbers of aliens, non-American citizens from the United States. And he ordered his Justice Department agents to go out and arrest large numbers of people. These were called the Palmer raids, because there was a law that if you were not an American citizen, but you were a follower of anarchism or Bolshevism in the government's eyes, you could be deported. And they did deport some, including a shipload of some 250 people that Emma Goldman was on. But there was a very wily, clever bureaucrat inside the government, Louis F. Post, who managed to stop Palmer's attempts at these massive deportations, who saved thousands of people from being deported from the United States, and who did so from inside the government. And I do think that sometimes in regimes that are not yet completely totalitarian, good people inside the government can stop bad things from happening. And in American Midnight, you'll find a detailed description of how Louis Post did that.
That's really nice that you focus on these lesser known characters who did a great deal of fighting these, as you said, quasi-totalitarian structure. What I wanted to know, because I'm not sure if it's super important, but when I think about the US, it's always very religious. There's always kind of Jesus around on Christianity.
Yeah.
I think it's also used, right? I feel like it's very much used to manipulate people. I feel like this is something highly American, that even though this is a very industrialized country with like great academia, there are still so many people who are hyper religious and refuse to see like facts of evolution, for example.
Yeah.
So I was wondering when this came into place. I mean, in American Midnight, it doesn't play a great role, right?
Not really in that period, but there's sort of a tradition in American politics, of at least national politics, of people talking about their religious beliefs. It's pretty rare that you ever find somebody who's a serious contender in a presidential election who will say, I'm an atheist or I'm an agnostic. It almost never happens. And we still see a lot of that in American politics today. Mike Johnson, this guy from Louisiana who just got elected Speaker of the House of Representatives, is somebody who says the Bible determines everything I do, which is ridiculous, totally ridiculous. But this is a very popular position among a small but fervent sector of the American population. Our actual percentage of people in this country who are regular churchgoers has declined steadily over the years. But it's one of those voting blocks that politicians want to appeal to. And especially in the southern states, conservative areas of the country, it's very strong.
So the southern part of the US is still more conservative, still religious, as you say. Is it coming from the time of the American Civil War?
Well, to some degree, the southern part of the U.S. has always been more conservative than the rest of the country. I think because it evolved out of a plantation economy, an agrarian economy rather than an industrial one. And there wasn't this tremendous flow of immigrants that really defined the big cities of the North and the Midwest, where you had millions, tens of millions of people coming from primarily from Europe, shaped those cities. But in the South, there was a much more established agriculture-based society. And of course, the South has become industrialized since then, but those traditions are still very strong. And in the southern state in particular, if you're running for governor or senator, you want to get photographed going to church on Sunday. Not so in other parts of the country.
Yeah, that's just very fascinating for me. In Germany, religion doesn't play that of a big role anymore.
When I speak in Europe, I find people ask me, what is this with religion in American life? People are religious here. We've got churches and cathedrals, but it doesn't come into our politics.
Yeah.
It's peculiar that it does in the United States, but it's always been there. And for a lot of reasons, of course, some of the earliest American settlements, like the people who came from England to Massachusetts in 1620, were religious pilgrims who felt persecuted in England and wanted to establish a sort of pure theocracy in the United States. And some of that tradition has kind of lingered on in this country.
In your book, the socialist movement, the labor movements play a critical role. I was wondering, what do you think about the movements today? Because at least in Germany or in Europe, the right wingers are kind of getting stronger. They're getting louder. Populist movements are getting louder, which are most of the time right wingers. But I feel like maybe the leftists, the labor movement, they need a more united or stronger voice. I was wondering what your point of view is to that.
Actually, the last 5 or 10 years, I think we have seen something of a rebirth of certain movements on the American left. You do have a handful of elected officials in this country who would call themselves democratic socialists, which certainly wasn't the case 20 years ago. But in certain states, like New York especially, a few members of Congress, Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont in the United States Senate, would call themselves democratic socialists. And also, perhaps even more significantly, the last couple of years have seen some significant victories for the labor movement. The recent settlement of strikes in the auto industry saw huge gains by the United Auto Workers, huge wage. There is some organizing now at industries that have been determinedly non-organized before. Nationwide chains of coffee shops like Starbucks and Peet's, beginnings of organizing at Amazon factories and warehouses. It's going to be very tough to make progress there. And we still have only a very small percentage of the workforce in this country, only around 10 or 12%, far less than it is in most European countries, belongs to labor unions. And a very high percentage of that are people belonging unionized government employees. But still, I sense something of a rebirth there, although there's a long way to go. And we are still living in a country with enormous disparities of wealth between the rich and the poor. And that gap is not closing. So we have a lot of work to do.
Then I have two last questions. I would like to know, do you have like one of the books or articles or projects you had? Do you have a favorite?
Yes. I think of all of my books, my favorite is the book I mentioned, my memoir of my relationship with my father, Half the Way Home is its title. Of the other books, most of which are histories, my favorite is a book called To End All Wars, which came out about a dozen years ago. It's been translated into German and many other languages. And it's a book about the First World War, which sees the war as not as a conflict between two sides, but between people who saw it as a noble crusade and people who thought it was absolute madness and who refused to fight. And in that book, I focused on Britain, where that conflict was most extreme and where they had the most interesting and colorful anti-war movement. And I think of my history books, that's the favorite because very few other people have told the story of that war in those terms.
That's leading now to my last question, which is if you have plans for further projects. For example, you mentioned this Filipino-American War. I was thinking if this might be something, or if you have something else in mind.
Well, there's a lot about the Philippine War in American Midnight because veterans of the Philippine War played a big role in the repression of the country in 1917 to 1921. Because we're always fighting these foreign wars, we have a lot of veterans who come back, just the way veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan could be found in the crowd that invaded the U.S. Capitol January 6, 21. I'm working on a book now about the 1930s, the Great Depression in the United States, and how the episodes of the Great Depression were reflected in a very bold program under Roosevelt's New Deal, something called the Federal Theater Project, where a program took live theater to parts of the country, to communities that had never seen it before, and did so with some politically very, very bold plays. And eventually they got shut down as a result by the right wing, but they did some extraordinary cultural achievements before that happened. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Amazing. Do you have already found your heroes and your villains of the story?
Yes. But you'll have to read the book to find out.
Okay, so I have to be patient. Thank you so much for the interview. I learned a lot, and I also think my audience appreciated you took the time and share all of these amazing facts and informations, your life, your work, your challenges. Thank you so much.
I don't have any great last words of wisdom, but thank you, Thea, and I hope your viewers find this interesting.
They will definitely. Thank you so much.